The night the temperature dropped below zero, they said it was pointless to fight it. They said the weak would freeze, the strong would survive, and that was just the way winter worked. But one quiet cowboy stood alone in a wooden barn, listening to newborn lambs struggle for breath, and he decided that losing them was not an option. While the storm howled and the world turned its back, he built something everyone laughed at. What happened next would change an entire town and save lives no one thought could be saved. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Cheyenne, Wyoming. Winter 1918. Winter settled over Cheyenne the way a debt settles over a man, quietly at first, then all at once. By early December, the wind had stripped the land down to its essentials. The prairie lay open and colorless, broken only by fence lines and distant barns hunched low against the sky. Snow did not fall gently here. It came driven sideways, pressed flat by a wind that never seemed to rest. At night, the temperature dropped so hard it cracked shallow ponds and split old boards that had already endured decades of use. Morning brought no relief, only a pale sun hanging uselessly behind thin cloud, offering light without warmth. 2 miles outside town, Elias Crowder stood in the open doorway of his barn and watched the day take shape. He was 33 years old, tall and lean, built more from labor than from food. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, stiff with age and mended twice along the sleeves. His dark hair was cut short and hidden beneath a boutsi, worn felt hat whose brim had lost its symmetry years ago. A narrow scar traced the line of his chin, the faint reminder of a young horse that had taught him, early on, the cost of standing too close to impatience. His face was angular, weathered, and often mistaken for hardness. Those who worked with him longer knew better. Elias was not hard. He was deliberate. Inside the barn, the ewes shifted uneasily in their pens. Their wool was thick and dirty from winter confinement, and their breath rose in slow clouds. Elias listened to them as much as he watched. He had learned over the years that animals spoke plainly if a man bothered to pay attention. Their restlessness told him what the calendar already had. Lambing season was near. Last year, that knowledge had come too late. He had lost 12 lambs in less than 3 nights, born damp into cold that tightened around them like a hand. He could still remember the weight of the first one he'd carried out behind the barn at dawn, its small body rigid, its mother pacing and bleeding without sense or direction. By the time the weather eased, he had buried more than he cared to count. The men in town had called it bad luck, nature's way. Elias had accepted the words without agreeing to them. Luck explained nothing. It excused everything. He stepped fully into the barn, pulling the door shut against the wind. The smell of hay, manure, and animal heat wrapped around him, not warm, but alive. He moved along the row of pens, checking feed, adjusting straw, running his hands along the boards where cold air found gaps. When he reached the far wall, he stopped. Lined neatly along the cleared space were 6 wooden structures, each about 4 feet long and waist high. They were plain, built from rough-cut pine, the edges sanded smooth where an animal might rub against them. Each had a hinged front panel and a small window cut into one side, covered with oilcloth, stretched tight and sealed with pitch. Elias crouched and tested a latch, then pressed his palm flat against the wood, feeling for drafts. There were none. Behind him, the barn door opened and closed again. Martha Crowder entered carrying a metal pail. She moved quietly, as if the cold itself might be startled by noise. Martha was 28, though grief had lent her a steadiness that made her seem older. Her husband had died in France 2 years earlier, and she had returned to Wyoming with a single trunk and no intention of being fragile. She was of average height, solidly built, with chestnut brown hair pinned up beneath a wool scarf. Her face was pale from winter, her green eyes observant and calm. She spoke little, but when she did, it was with purpose. "I brought the mash," she said. Elias straightened and took the pail from her. "Thank you." She set the lantern on a beam and looked at the wooden huts. "You finished 6 more." "I will before nightfall." She nodded, stepping closer to inspect one. Her fingers traced the edge of the oilcloth window before she withdrew them, skin already reddening from the cold. "They look solid." They need to be, Elias said. A lamb won't trust something that moves or makes noise. Martha glanced toward the ewes. They're close. I know. She hesitated, then asked, will it be enough? Elias did not answer immediately. He reached for a lantern hook and adjusted the height by 1/2 inch, then stepped back to judge the angle. It has to be, he said at last. Martha understood what he meant. Enough was not a calculation. It was a decision. That afternoon, Elias drove into Cheyenne for feed and oil. The town streets were rutted with frozen mud. Wagon tracks hardened into ridges that shook the truck as it passed. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns that bent and broke apart in the wind. Inside McCrary's feed and supply, the pot-bellied stove radiated uneven heat, drawing men close like moths. Jonah Bell stood. Among them, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, his dark mustache trimmed neat against his upper lip. He was 42 and ran the largest sheep operation in the county. His coat was new, his boots well kept. He carried himself with the assurance of a man accustomed to being right. Crowder, Jonah said as Elias entered, heard you're building shelters for lambs. A few men chuckled. Wade Larkin, older and stooped, spat into the sawdust near the stove. His beard was gray and uneven, his hands permanently stained from tobacco. Next thing, he'll be tucking them in. Elias set his gloves on the counter. Shelter's not new, he said, just smaller. Jonah tilted his head. And what's keeping them warm? Stored heat, Elias replied. Controlled. Wade shook his head. Cold kills the weak, always has. Cold kills the unprotected, Elias said evenly. The laughter faded into mutters. Jonah studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. Hope it's worth the lumber. Elias paid for his supplies and left without further comment. Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying snow that stung the face like grit. He drove home with his jaw set, the road barely visible beneath the drifted white. By dusk, the sky had darkened to iron gray. The temperature dropped fast. Elias worked by lantern light, finishing the last hinges and checking every seam. Martha brought coffee and stood nearby, watching as he worked. You didn't sleep much last night, she said. I'll sleep later. She did not press him. As full dark settled, the ewes began to stir in earnest. Elias closed the barn doors and set the lantern beside the first wooden hut. Outside, the wind howled and pressed against the boards. Inside, the animals shifted, breathed, waited. Elias Crowder pulled off his gloves and rubbed his hands together, then stood quietly in the center of the barn. The winter had come early. The storm was building. And for the first time since last year, he was ready to meet it. The storm arrived the way Elias had known it would, not with drama, but with certainty. By midnight, the wind had risen into a steady, forceful presence, pressing against the barn walls as if testing their resolve. Snow hissed across the roof in fine sheets, finding every loose seam, every old nail that had worked itself thin over the years. Inside, the lanterns burned low and steady, their light stretching long shadows across the packed earth floor. Elias had not sat down once since nightfall. He moved slowly through the barn, deliberate and quiet, boots sinking into straw dampened by breath and time. The ewes sensed what was coming. Their murmurs had shifted into something sharper, more urgent, a low chorus of discomfort that rose and fell without rhythm. He stopped beside one of the older animals, a broad-backed ewe with cloudy eyes and a torn ear from a fence long ago. She pawed the ground, sides tightening, breath quickening. This one's first, Elias murmured. Though no, one had asked. Martha sat on an overturned crate near the wall, wrapped in her coat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched without interfering. Years of loss had taught her that not every moment required words. Sometimes stillness was the only useful offering. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, distant, muted by snow, but the sound carried weight. Elias straightened and reached for the lantern, adjusting it higher. He checked the nearest warming hut again, pressing on the boards, testing the latch, confirming the interior temperature by instinct as much as touch. The stored heat within the stones and insulated walls had held. That mattered. It had to matter. The ewe let out a strained bleat and shifted her weight heavily. Elias crouched beside her, calm and focused, his movements practiced. He had delivered dozens of lambs over the years, but no birth ever felt routine. Each one carried its own risk, its own narrow margin between beginning and ending. He spoke softly, not in words meant to comfort so much as words meant to remain steady. The birth was slow, but clean. When the lamb finally slid free, it landed in the straw with a sound barely louder than a breath. Small, dark, and slick with fluid, it lay still for one terrible second before its chest hitched and its legs twitched weakly. Elias waited. He always waited. Then the lamb coughed, a thin, reedy sound, and drew its first full breath. "Good," Elias said quietly. The ewe bent immediately, licking with rough urgency, but the cold was already working. The lamb's small body shuddered, legs trembling without coordination. Elias reached in, firm but gentle, and lifted it. The weight was slight, too slight. He carried it quickly to the nearest warming hut, opening the hinged panel with care. Warmth rolled outward, subtle but unmistakable. The lamb's movement stilled as instinct took over, drawing it toward the heat without understanding why. Elias laid the lamb inside and stepped back. Its breathing slowed, then steadied. He closed the panel part way, leaving space for air and sight, then motioned the ewe forward. She hesitated, nostrils flaring, eyes wide at the unfamiliar shape and scent of the wood. Elias placed a hand against her shoulder, steady and sure. After a moment, she stepped closer, lowering her head to peer inside. Martha rose quietly from her crate. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased. One life, then another. The second birth came less than an hour later, faster but harder. This lamb arrived wrong. One leg tucked back, the body struggling against its own entrance. Elias worked carefully, sweat breaking beneath his coat despite the cold. When the lamb finally emerged, it did not cry. Its chest moved once, then stopped. Elias did not hesitate. He rubbed the lamb briskly with straw, clearing its mouth, forcing air where there was none. Seconds stretched thin. Then, abruptly, the lamb gasped, its body jerking in protest at being pulled back into the world. Martha let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. This lamb went into the second warming hut, its temperature dropping dangerously low before Elias got the panel closed. He checked the interior again, held steady. The system was working, but only just. That knowledge sat heavy in his chest. The margin was narrow, too narrow to be careless. As the night deepened, the storm pressed harder. The barn groaned in complaint. Snow piled against the lower walls, sealing gaps and creating new ones. Elias moved constantly, adjusting straw, checking animals, inspecting each warming hut in turn. By dawn, 3 lambs lay inside 3 huts, breathing evenly, their small sides rising and falling in time with the quiet hum of stored warmth. Martha brewed coffee on the small iron stove near the barn wall, the bitter smell cutting through the damp air. She handed Elias a tin cup without ceremony. "They made it through the night," she said. "So far." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "You're shaking." He flexed his hands. "Cold." She didn't argue, but she fetched an extra coat and draped it over his shoulders. Elias accepted it without comment. The storm eased slightly as morning broke, though the cold deepened. The sky lightened to a flat, merciless white. Elias stepped outside briefly, boots crunching through fresh drifts. The world beyond the barn was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as if sound itself had frozen. He could not see the road. He could barely see the fence line. When he returned inside, a truck engine sounded faintly through the snow. It grew louder, uneven, struggling. Elias stiffened. Martha looked toward the door. A moment later, the barn door opened with effort, and a man stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He was tall and broad, his beard thick and black with streaks of gray. His coat was heavy wool, patched at the elbows, and his eyes were sharp despite the cold. This was Samuel Pike, a neighboring rancher Elias knew only in passing. Pike was 38, known for his blunt manner and his refusal to accept help even when he needed it most. "Didn't expect anyone else foolish enough to be up in this," Pike said, glancing around. Elias nodded once. "You all right?" Pike's mouth tightened. "Lost 2 already," he said flatly. "Thought I heard you were experimenting." Elias said nothing. He simply opened one of the warming hut panels and let Pike see inside. The man leaned forward, his expression shifting. "They're alive," he said, not quite a question. They are, Elias replied. Pike straightened slowly, rubbing his beard. I don't suppose you've room for one more. Elias looked at the remaining empty huts, 3 of them, and then at Pike. Bring it, he said. They worked together without speaking much. Pike carried the lamb, Elias guided it inside, and Martha added fresh straw. When the panel closed, and the lamb stilled, Pike exhaled sharply. I laughed when Jonah told me, Pike admitted. Guess that makes me a fool. Elias shook his head. It makes you human. By midday, 5 warming huts were occupied. The storm showed no sign of leaving. Elias stood in the center of the barn, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. But beneath it was something steadier. Proof. Not certainty, not victory. Just proof that effort could still matter. He met Martha's gaze across the barn. She nodded once. The winter was far from finished, but the first night had been answered. Morning did not bring relief. It brought clarity, which was often worse. The storm had loosened its grip just enough to reveal the damage it was still doing elsewhere. The wind dropped from a roar to a constant grinding push, and the snow stopped falling long enough for the cold to settle deeper into the ground. The air inside the barn felt heavier now, dense with breath, wool, damp straw, and the faint mineral scent of stored heat seeping from the warming huts. Elias Crowder stood near the center post, shoulders stiff, eyes moving from one hut to the next. 5 lambs lay inside 5 wooden shelters, their small bodies curled tight, breathing slow and even. The ewes stood close, some watching through the oilcloth windows, others chewing cud with distracted focus. Nothing in the barn was calm, but nothing was failing either. That balance felt fragile, like a rope stretched tight between 2 posts. He had not slept. Not truly. He had closed his eyes leaning against a stall wall once, or twice. But each time his mind snapped awake at the slightest sound. A scrape of hoof, a change in breathing, the creak of a board responding to cold. Fatigue sat low in his body, not sharp enough to cripple him, but heavy enough to demand attention. Martha moved quietly along the far wall, replacing water pans before they froze solid. She worked with her coat buttoned high and her sleeves rolled down, her hair pinned tight beneath her scarf. There was a bruise forming on her left forearm where a ewe had shifted suddenly during the night, but she made no mention of it. She carried herself with the same contained steadiness Elias recognized from his own reflection. Loss had trained them both to function past comfort. Samuel Pike remained near the door, hat in hand, as if unsure whether he had earned the right to stay. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a beard that grew thick and uneven, dark shot through with gray. His eyes followed Elias constantly, measuring, without hostility. Pike had spent his life relying on muscle, habit, and endurance. Asking for help sat poorly on him, but the sight of his lamb breathing steadily inside the warming hut had quieted something sharp in his chest. You keep checking them, Pike said at last. Elias nodded. Cold doesn't announce itself. It just takes. Pike shifted his weight. Jonah won't like this. Elias did not respond immediately. Jonah Bell's shadow stretched far in the county. Where Jonah approved, others followed. Where he dismissed, few dared contradict him. Elias knew that. He also knew that proof carried a different kind of weight. Jonah doesn't need to like it, Elias said. He just needs to see it. As if summoned by the thought, a shape appeared beyond the barn doors. Hooves crunched against packed snow. A horse snorted, impatient with the cold. Moments later, the door opened and Jonah Bell stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He filled the doorway easily. Tall and thick through the chest, his coat brushed clean despite the storm. His mustache was trimmed sharp, his jaw clean-shaven beneath it. He had the look of a man who slept indoors and expected the world to meet him halfway. Behind him followed a younger man, slight and narrow-faced, with a collar turned up too high and gloves too thin for the weather. This was Thomas Hale, Jonah's foreman, barely 25, with pale hair and the anxious attentiveness of someone still learning when to speak. Jonah took in the barn with a slow, deliberate sweep of his eyes. He said nothing at first. He walked to the nearest warming hut and bent slightly, peering through the oilcloth window. The lamb inside shifted, stretched one leg, then settled again. Well, Jonah said finally, it's alive. It is, Elias replied. Jonah straightened and moved to the next hut, then the next. His face gave little away, but the crease between his brows deepened. 5, he said. All born since last night? Yes. And you've lost none? No. Jonah turned to Pike. You? Pike's jaw tightened. Lost 2 before I came here. This one would have been the 3rd. Jonah exhaled through his nose. Weather's not done yet. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Jonah's eyes returned to the huts. What happens when the heat fails? It won't, Elias said. Not all at once. That's not an answer, Jonah said flatly. Elias met his gaze. It's the only honest one. The 2 men studied each other in silence. Jonah Bell had built his operation on control, of land, of animals, of men. Elias Crowder worked with limits instead, shaping his efforts around what could not be commanded. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. A sudden bleat cut through the tension. One of the younger ewes had gone down near the back stall, legs trembling. Elias moved immediately, lantern in hand. Jonah, and Pike following without being asked. The ewe's breathing was shallow, uneven. Elias knelt, checking position, feeling for movement. This one's early, he said. Too early. Martha stepped in beside him, her face composed but alert. She fetched clean straw and laid it thick. Jonah hovered, arms crossed, his authority useless in this moment. The birth came hard and wrong. The lamb emerged weak, barely responsive, its body limp in Elias's hands. Its tongue lolled, pale against the dark of its mouth. The cold had already taken too much. Elias acted without hesitation. He cleared the airway, rubbed vigorously, then carried the lamb toward the last empty warming hut. Inside, the heat was ready, but readiness did not guarantee survival. The lamb's chest fluttered, stopped, then fluttered again. Pike sucked in a sharp breath. Martha pressed her lips together. Elias did not look up. He worked steadily, methodically, refusing panic. After a long moment, the lamb drew a full breath and cried, a thin, broken sound, but unmistakably alive. Something shifted in Jonah Bell's expression then. Not amazement, recognition. That would have died, Jonah said quietly. Anywhere else? Yes, Elias said. It would have. The storm pressed against the barn again, reminding them that the night's mercy was temporary. Jonah stepped back, rubbing his gloved hands together. You don't have enough of these, he said. No, Elias agreed. How many more births you expect? Over the next 3 days, a dozen, maybe more. Jonah's mouth tightened. You won't manage. Elias looked at the row of huts. 5 occupied, 1 newly filled, 3 more unfinished stacked against the wall. I will, he said. If I have to. Jonah considered him. You're running yourself thin. Yes. Why? The question hung heavier than Jonah intended. Elias straightened slowly. Because last year taught me what happens when you don't try. Jonah said nothing. He turned to Thomas Hale. Go back, he said. Bring lumber, nails, oilcloth, whatever he asks for. Thomas blinked. Sir? Now. The young man nodded and left quickly, relief and fear chasing each other across his face. Jonah remained. He walked the barn once more, slower now, eyes lingering on details. I'll tell the others, he said at last. They won't listen right away. They don't have to, Elias said. Not yet. Jonah paused at the door. Crowder, he said, if this holds through tonight, things will change. Elias nodded once. As Jonah and Pike left, the barn settled into its uneasy rhythm again. The lambs slept, the ewes watched, the wind waited. Martha came to Elias's side. You could have said no. Elias shook his head. No doesn't save anyone. She studied him, then reached out and squeezed his arm once, hard and brief. It was all the encouragement either of them required. Outside, the sky darkened again. The cold deepened. Inside the barn, proof had taken root, but proof was only the beginning. The second night tested resolve more than endurance. The storm no longer announced itself with violence. Instead, it lingered, patient and unyielding, like a creditor who had decided to wait rather than leave. Snow pressed against the barn walls in quiet accumulation, sealing sound and light alike. The cold deepened, sinking into timber and bone, into breath itself. Inside, the barn held a dim, amber hush broken only by the slow movement of animals and the occasional creak of wood responding to strain. Elias Crowder stood at the far end of the barn, bent over a half-finished warming hut. His hands moved with practiced economy, measuring, fitting, tightening. Fatigue had settled into him fully now. His shoulders ached, and his fingers were stiff enough that each nail-driven required conscious effort. He had eaten little since the night before, but hunger barely registered. What mattered was time. Time and material. Both were running thin. 6 huts were occupied. 1 more stood empty, but ready. 3 remained unfinished, their boards stacked neatly along the wall like a promise not yet kept. Elias counted berths again in his head, the way a man counts ammunition when he knows the fight is not over. Jonah Bell's lumber would help if it arrived in time, if the roads held, if the storm allowed it. Martha worked nearby, sorting straw, her movements slower now, but no less deliberate. The bruise on her arm had darkened to a deep violet, though she still made no mention of it. She had grown paler with exhaustion, her eyes ringed with faint shadows, but her posture remained upright, uncomplaining. She had learned during the war that collapse was a private matter, not something to indulge in public. "You should eat," she said quietly, setting a piece of bread on a crate near Elias. "In a minute." She didn't argue. She never did. A low growl broke the barn's quiet, a familiar sound, sharp and alert. Elias looked up as a dog moved out from beneath the feed table. The animal was a rough-coated shepherd mix, gray and black with a white blaze across his chest. He was 5 years old, thick through the neck, one ear permanently bent from an old frostbite injury. His name was Bracken. He had belonged to Elias since he was a pup, raised alongside the flock, loyal without fuss. Bracken moved now with purpose, nose lifted, tail stiff. "Someone's coming," Elias said. Moments later, the sound of hooves cut through the muffled air outside. A horse snorted, impatient, stamping against snow. Elias straightened slowly, every muscle tightening. Visitors were becoming less surprising, but no less risky. Every new body brought heat loss, distraction, the chance of disorder. The barn door opened, and cold rushed in like water. A man stepped through, pulling his coat tight behind him. He was lean, slightly stooped, with a long face and a beard trimmed close along his jaw. His hair was light brown, thinning at the temples, and his eyes were pale and watchful. He carried himself carefully, as if conserving energy was a habit learned over time. This was Walter Finch, a small-scale sheep farmer from the eastern edge of the county. 45 years old, widowed 5 winters back, known for keeping to himself and minding his ledgers with near religious attention. Loss had made him cautious to the point of suspicion. "Crowder," Finch said, voice rough from cold. "Bell sent me." Elias nodded once. "Did he?" Finch glanced around, his gaze lingering on the warming huts. "Said I should see this for myself." "You're seeing it." Finch removed his gloves, flexing his fingers slowly. "I've lost 4 since yesterday morning." Martha looked away. Finch continued. "I don't have the lumber for this. Don't have the time either, but I have 2 ewes close to birthing. I can't keep them alive out there." Elias considered him. Finch was not a man who asked easily. Pride sat in him like a brittle thing, once broken, never repaired. "What are you asking?" Elias said. Finch hesitated. "I'm asking if you'd take them, just until the storm breaks." Martha looked at Elias sharply. The barn was already stretched. Heat reserves were holding, but barely. Each additional body pulled from the same margin. Elias weighed the request in silence. This was the price Jonah had hinted at. Proof invited demand. Demand did not always arrive politely. "I can take one," Elias said at last. "Not 2. Finch swallowed. "One might live, the other won't." "That may be," Elias said evenly, "but if I take 2 and lose both, that helps no one." The words were blunt, but not cruel. Finch studied him, then nodded slowly. "Fair." They moved quickly. Finch led 1 ewe inside, older and heavier, already laboring. Elias guided her to the empty hut, clearing straw, adjusting the latch. The birth came fast, the lamb strong enough to cry on its own. When it settled, into the warmth, Finch let out a long breath, shoulders sagging as if something had finally been set down. "Thank you," Finch said. It cost him to say it. Elias could hear that. "You should go," Elias replied, "before the road closes again." Finch nodded and left without lingering. Bracken followed him to the door, then returned to his place beneath the table, watchful once more. As night deepened, the strain inside the barn grew more apparent. The stored heat stones began to cool faster than before. Elias noticed it in the way the lambs shifted more often, in the way breath fogged thicker against the oilcloth windows. He adjusted insulation, packed straw tighter, sealed gaps with cloth and pitch. Still, the margin narrowed. By midnight, another ewe went down. This birth was ordinary, uncomplicated. The lamb entered the world breathing strong, but the question was no longer strength, it was space. Elias had no empty hut left. He stood still for a long moment, lantern hanging uselessly at his side. Martha waited, silent. The lamb shivered at the ewe's feet, already losing ground. Elias made his choice. He moved to the unfinished stack of boards and pulled them down, scattering snow-dusted wood across the floor. His hands worked fast, no longer careful but precise. He cut corners where he could, simplified joints, sacrificed finish for speed. Martha fetched nails, held boards, packed straw. Bracken lay nearby, head on paws, eyes following every movement. The hut came together crude but solid. No window, no oilcloth, just wood, straw, and heat stone packed tight. They moved the lamb inside moments before its trembling turned dangerous. Elias sagged back against the wall, breath ragged. Martha handed him the bread again. This time he took it. "Jonah's supplies won't be enough," she said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "They won't." "Then what happens?" Elias looked at the row of huts, at the lambs sleeping inside. Them, each one alive because someone had refused to accept the first answer offered by winter. "Then we choose who we can save," he said, "and we live with the rest." Martha closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. Outside, the wind rose again, stronger now, rattling the barn door. Somewhere beyond the snow, other lambs were being born into cold with no shelter waiting. Elias Crowder stood in the dim light of his barn, surrounded by proof and consequence alike, and understood fully that the hardest part of changing things was not building something new. It was deciding where its limits lay. The storm was not finished. Neither was he. The cold changed character sometime after midnight. It stopped pressing and began to settle, sinking into the land with a slow, deliberate patience that felt almost thoughtful. The wind fell away, until even the barn seemed surprised by the silence. Snow no longer hissed against the walls. Instead, it lay piled deep and heavy, muffling the world beyond the timber and boards. Inside the barn, the quiet was so complete that every sound, every breath, every shift of straw carried weight. Elias Crowder noticed it first in the lambs. They were not crying. They were not stirring. They slept too deeply, their bodies curled tight, their small chests rising and falling with a slowness that made his own breathing hitch. He moved from hut to hut, lantern held close, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion blurring the edges of his vision. The oilcloth windows were fogged, but when he wiped them clear with his sleeve, he saw no immediate danger, no shivering, no stiffness. Still, something felt wrong. Heat was leaving the barn, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, the way water drains from a cracked basin if no one is watching. Elias knelt beside the crudely built hut from the night before, the one without a window, without refinement. He pressed his palm against the wood. Cold. Not frozen, but wrong. He lifted the lid and felt the air spill out, thinner than it should have been. The lamb inside stirred, let out a weak sound, then fell still again. "Damn it," Elias muttered. Martha was at his side instantly. She did not ask what was wrong. She had learned to read his shoulders, the set of his jaw. "The stones," she said. "They've cooled." "Yes." The stored heat that had carried them through the worst of the storm was bleeding away faster than expected. Too many bodies, too much demand. Elias had known this would come. Knowing it did not make the moment easier. He stood and scanned the barn, counting again. 8 huts occupied now. More than he had planned for. More than his calculations had ever allowed. Proof had invited hope, and hope had arrived with needs of its own. Bracken lifted his head from the floor, ears pricked. The dog moved closer, sensing tension, his rough tail brushing the straw once before settling again. He was loyal without drama, present without demand. "We need more heat," Martha said quietly. "There isn't any," Elias replied. She met his eyes. "Then we make some." Elias looked past her toward the small iron stove near the wall. It had been used sparingly, just enough to keep water from freezing solid. He had avoided relying on it for the huts. Open flame was risk, and risk multiplied fast in a barn full of animals and straw. But now the risk was shifting. Cold was becoming the greater threat. He weighed the decision carefully. Fire could kill them all if it went wrong. Cold would kill them one by one if he did nothing. "Bring the shovel," he said. They worked. Together without speaking, Elias breaking down chunks of coal, Martha feeding them into the stove. The iron groaned as it warmed, expanding with a low, complaining sound. Elias adjusted the vents carefully, coaxing heat without inviting sparks. He carried heated stones with thick gloves, moving them from the stove to the huts in rotation, never leaving the fire unattended. Time slowed into fragments. Move, check, adjust, listen. The lamb in the crude hut shivered once, then again. Elias moved it into one of the better insulated shelters, displacing a stronger lamb that could afford the loss of warmth for a short time. It was a gamble, but a calculated one. Strength, he had learned, was a resource to be managed, not admired. Hours passed like this, measured not by clock or sky, but by breath and temperature. Elias lost all sense of his own body. Pain became background noise. Hunger faded entirely. What remained was focus, sharp and narrow as a blade. Near dawn, a sound broke the calm. Quiet. A cough, then another. Elias froze, lantern half raised. The sound did not come from the animals. It came from the door. Someone was outside. Bracken rose silently, teeth bared, a low warning rumble in his chest. "Easy," Elias whispered. The barn door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside, pulling it shut behind him with care. He was older, perhaps in his early 50s, tall but stooped, his beard long and iron gray, frost clinging to it in brittle crystals. His coat was threadbare but clean, mended at the seams with a hand that valued function over pride. His eyes were dark and deep-set, the eyes of a man who had spent years watching horizons for trouble. This was Nathan Cole. Elias knew him by reputation alone, a former drover who had lost his ranch years back to illness and debt, now living on the outskirts of town, trading labor for shelter when winter grew cruel. Cole was known as steady, quiet, and painfully honest. He spoke little because words had failed. Him once, and he had never forgiven them. "I heard there were lambs alive out here," Cole said. His voice was rough, unused. Elias studied him for a long moment. "There are." Cole nodded. "Then you need help." It was not a question. Martha stepped forward. "You're freezing." "So are they," Cole replied. He removed his coat and hung it on a peg without ceremony, revealing a thin wool shirt beneath. His arms were corded with old strength, the kind that comes from years of repetitive work rather than youth. Elias hesitated only a moment. "Can you keep a fire steady?" Cole's mouth twitched. "I kept a line camp alive in the Dakotas winter of '02. Fire's the only thing that listens if you treat it right." Elias handed him the shovel. They fell into a rhythm quickly. Cole tended the stove with care that bordered on reverence, feeding it slowly, adjusting airflow with practiced instinct. Elias returned to the huts, redistributing heat, rotating. Lambs where needed, watching for signs of distress. Martha moved between them, silent and efficient, carrying water, replacing straw, checking ewes. As dawn crept pale and uncertain through the cracks in the barn walls, the lambs began to stir. One stretched, bleated softly. Another nudged at its mother's flank. The air inside the huts warmed, slowly but surely. Elias sagged against a post, his legs trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Martha handed him a cup of water. He drank it down without tasting it. Cole approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "You can't keep this up," he said simply. Elias met his gaze. "I don't plan to. Just long enough." "For what?" "For winter to loosen its grip," Elias replied, "or for help to arrive." Cole glanced around the barn, at the row of huts, at the lambs alive where there should have been none. "Help already has," he said. Elias did not argue. When the sun finally rose fully, weak and distant, but present, the storm at last began to break. The temperature remained brutal, but the air shifted. The silence outside lifted slightly, replaced by the faint creak of snow settling under its own weight. Inside the barn, all lambs were alive. Elias stood in the center of the space, exhaustion finally claiming him, and understood something new. Survival was no longer just about his idea or his hands. It was about what that idea pulled into being: choices, consequences, and people willing to stand in the cold long enough to see it through. The night had nearly taken everything. It had failed. The storm finally loosened its hold, but it did not leave quietly. It retreated the way a stubborn thing does, slowly, reluctantly, leaving behind a landscape reshaped by its passing. Snow lay piled in uneven drifts against fences and outbuildings, some nearly as high as the barn doors. The sky cleared to a pale, brittle blue that offered light without mercy. Cold still ruled the land, but it was no longer hunting. It was waiting. Inside Elias Crowder's barn, the air had changed. The sharp edge of panic was gone, replaced by a weary vigilance. Lambs stirred more freely now, their movements clumsy but deliberate. A few tested their legs, wobbling and collapsing back into straw with soft, indignant bleats. The ewes watched closely, calmer than before, their bodies relaxed in a way Elias had not seen in days. Elias stood near the stove, hands wrapped around a tin cup, steam rising faintly into the chilled air. His face looked drawn now, hollowed slightly beneath the cheekbones. The Yitushkis scar on his chin stood out pale against skin reddened by cold and sleeplessness. He had not slept more than an hour at a stretch since the storm began, and the strain showed, not in panic, but in the careful way he moved, conserving what little energy remained. Nathan Cole tended the stove nearby, feeding it slowly, respectfully. In daylight, Elias could see more clearly the marks time had left on the older man. Cole's beard was thick and iron gray, his face deeply lined, not with bitterness, but with long endurance. His hands bore old scars, rope burns, knife nicks, each one earned. He had spoken little through the night, but his presence had been steady, grounding. Martha entered from the house carrying a small ledger and a bundle of mail. She had taken a brief rest at dawn, just long enough to wash her face and change her coat. Her movements were slower now, fatigue pulling at her shoulders, but her eyes remained clear. "There are tracks on the road," she said. "Wagon. Tracks. More than one." Elias nodded. "Word travels faster than weather." He had expected this. Proof never stayed private for long. The first knock came just after mid-morning, a heavy sound against the barn door, confident and unhesitating. Bracken rose at once, positioning himself between the door and the nearest lambs, hackles lifting. Elias placed a hand on the dog's neck, steadying him. "Easy," he said. "They're not wolves." The door opened and a man stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He was stocky and broad-faced, with a thick red beard that caught the light like rusted wire. His eyes were pale blue, sharp and restless. He wore his authority casually, like a coat he expected to fit anywhere. This was Harold Keene, a livestock buyer who worked the surrounding counties, known for his blunt manner and his habit of seeing value before people did. Behind him came two others, both ranch hands by the look of them, younger, quieter, faces weathered, early by hard work and little rest. "Well," Keene said, surveying the barn with open interest, "looks like the stories weren't exaggerated." Elias did not invite him further. "You shouldn't be here," Keene smiled thinly. "Road's open enough, and I hear you've got lambs alive when others don't." "That's not a reason," Elias replied. Keene shrugged. "It is to me." He walked closer to the warming huts, crouching to peer through the oilcloth. One lamb bleated softly, unimpressed. Keene's smile widened. "You planning to sell?" he asked. The question landed heavily. Martha stiffened. Nathan Cole paused, shovel mid-air, eyes narrowing. "No," Elias said. Keene straightened. "Everything's for sale." Elias met his gaze. "Not today." Keene studied him for a long moment, then chuckled. "Fair enough. But understand this. Markets don't care how you kept them alive. They care that they're alive. Prices will spike after this storm. Men will be desperate." "I'm not," Elias said. Keene's smile faded slightly. "You will be. Everyone is, eventually." He turned toward the door, pausing only once. "Think about it," he said, then left with his men. The barn felt smaller after that. Not physically, but in the way temptation narrows space. Before Elias could return to his work, another group arrived. This time the knock was hesitant. The door opened to reveal 2 women and a boy no older than 12. The women were wrapped in heavy shawls, their faces drawn with worry. One of them stepped forward, thin and pale, her hair pulled back so tightly it emphasized the sharpness of her features. Her name was Ruth Maddox. Elias recognized her at once. Her husband had died the previous spring, crushed beneath a wagon axle. "Mayu's birthing," Ruth said, voice tight. "She's young. I don't know what to do." Elias glanced at the huts. Everyone was occupied. Martha moved closer, her ledger forgotten. "How far along?" "Hours," Ruth replied. "She's tiring." Elias felt the weight of the barn press down on him again. He had known this moment would come. Success was no longer quiet. "I can come," he said finally. Ruth's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you." He turned to Nathan. "Watch the stove." Nathan nodded. "Go." Elias saddled his horse, an aging bay named Flint, 16 years old, steady but slow. Flint's coat was rough with winter thickness, his eyes calm and dark. He had carried Elias through storms before. Bracken followed close, refusing to be left behind. The ride to Ruth's place was short but difficult. Snow dragged at Flint's legs, and the cold bit deep. When they arrived, the small barn was poorly insulated, the air sharp and unforgiving. The ewe lay down as Elias entered, sides heaving. The birth was hard. The lamb came weak, its breathing shallow. Elias worked quickly, but without warmth waiting. He could only do so much. He wrapped the lamb in cloth, rubbing until his hands burned. The lamb drew breath, once, twice, but the cold was relentless. By the time they returned to Elias's barn, the lamb was gone. Ruth did not cry. She only nodded, lips pressed together, grief already familiar to her. "I'm sorry," Elias said. "I know," she replied. "You tried." The words stayed with him long after she left. Back in the barn, life continued. Lambs stirred. The stove burned steadily. Nathan watched Elias closely as he returned. "You can't save them all," Nathan said quietly. Elias leaned against a post, exhaustion finally breaking through. "I know." "Then you need to decide what this is," Nathan continued. "A shelter or a promise." Elias looked around the barn, at the huts, the animals, the evidence of what was possible and what was not. He understood then that the town would not stop coming. Need had found a door, and doors once opened, rarely closed on their own. He straightened slowly. "It's a shelter," he said at last. "Not a miracle." Nathan nodded. "Good. Miracles break men." As the day wore on, more tracks appeared outside. More questions followed. Elias answered what he could and refused what he must. Each refusal cut a little deeper than the last. When night fell again, quieter than before, Elias stood alone for a moment in the center of the barn. The lambs slept, the fire held. Outside, the town waited. Winter had changed the rules, so had he. The notice went up at dawn, nailed crookedly to the depot's message board where lost gloves, church times, and cattle sales usually lived out their brief usefulness. It was written in Jonah Bell's hand, bold, efficient, impossible to mistake. Community meeting, livestock losses, tonight. By noon, everyone had seen it. Cheyenne had shaken off the worst of the storm, but the cold remained embedded in the ground and in the people who walked its streets. Snowbanks lined the roads like unfinished walls. Horses moved carefully, hooves ringing sharp against packed ice. Men spoke less than usual, their breath visible, their faces set in ways that suggested numbers being counted and recounted in their heads. Elias Crowder arrived at the depot just before sundown. He had not planned to come early, but instinct told him that arriving late would be taken for avoidance. He wore his usual coat, cleaned of straw and soot, but no newer than it had been the week before. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that were tired but alert. Bracken trotted beside him, stopping short of the doors, unwilling to enter the crowd. Elias tied the dog outside and gave him a brief nod. Bracken lay down immediately, chin on paws, watching. Inside, the depot smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Lanterns hung from hooks along the walls, throwing uneven light across the gathered men and women. Benches had been dragged in from the freight room. Some people stood anyway, arms crossed, backs against walls. Loss had not made them patient. Jonah Bell stood near the center, easily visible. He had shaved that morning, his mustache neatly trimmed, his coat buttoned tight. He looked like a man preparing to be listened to, whether others agreed or not. Near him stood Harold Keene, hands tucked into his pockets, red beard catching the lantern light. Keene's eyes moved constantly, cataloging faces, measuring moods. He had come not out of grief, but opportunity. Elias took a place near the back. Nathan Cole leaned against a post nearby, arms folded, expression unreadable. Martha sat on a bench to Elias's left, her hands clasped in her lap. She did not look at him, but he felt her presence steady as a fence post. Jonah raised a hand, and the room quieted. It took effort. "We've all lost something this week," Jonah began. His voice carried well, practiced from years of speaking over wind and distance. "Some more than others. Lambs, time, sleep, money." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "There are questions," Jonah continued, "about what happened, about what didn't." His eyes found Elias then. He did not look away. "We all heard about Crowder's barn," Jonah said, "about lambs that lived when others didn't." The murmur sharpened. Elias felt the shift immediately. Curiosity edged with resentment, hope tangled with suspicion. Harold Keene stepped forward without waiting to be invited. "Let's be plain," he said. "Some men lost everything. Some didn't. Folks deserve to know why." A man near the front spoke up, voice tight. "You saying we did something wrong?" Keene lifted one shoulder. "I'm saying results matter." Jonah shot him a warning glance, but Keene ignored it. Elias stepped forward then, before the conversation could tilt further. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften it either. "I didn't do anything special," Elias said. "I built shelters. I watched them. I adjusted when they failed." A woman stood abruptly. Ruth Maddox. Her face was pale, drawn tight with exhaustion and grief. "My lamb died," she said. "You came. You tried. It still died." The room stilled. "Yes," Elias said. "It did." Silence stretched. Elias did not fill it. Another man spoke, younger, anger breaking through fear. "So why them and not us?" Elias looked at him. "Because I had space, because I had heat, because I couldn't be everywhere." "That's not good enough," someone muttered. Nathan Cole pushed off the post then and stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step had been weighed. "No," Cole said. His voice was low, but it carried. "It isn't good enough. It's the truth." Heads turned. Cole was not a man many knew well, but his presence carried a certain gravity. He had lived long enough to stop explaining himself. "He didn't promise to save everyone," Cole continued. "You decided that for him." The room stirred again, discomfort spreading. Jonah cleared his throat. "This meeting isn't about blame," he said. "It's about learning." Keene snorted softly. "Learning costs money." "And ignorance costs lives," Jonah shot back. That drew a reaction. Keene's smile thinned, but he stepped back. Jonah turned fully toward Elias. "Tell them," he said, "what it took." Elias took a breath. He spoke plainly about the huts, the heat stones, the stove, the risks, the failures. He didn't embellish. He did not defend himself. He laid the facts out the way he had laid boards and straw, functional, unadorned. When he finished, the room was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now. He could feel it. Less accusation, more reckoning. A man Elias didn't recognize stepped forward then. He was tall and narrow, with a trimmed black beard and a scar pulling one side of his mouth downward. He introduced himself as Leonard Brooks, a carpenter from the south end of town. 40 years old, hands thick with callus, eyes sharp with practical assessment. "I could build those," Brooks said. "Not fancy, but fast." Jonah nodded. "That's the idea." Martha finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but it cut through the room cleanly. "Only if you understand their limits," she said. "They don't replace care. They don't replace watching." Several people looked at her then, surprised. She met their gaze steadily. "You still lose." "Some," she continued. "If you pretend otherwise, you'll lose more." That landed harder than any promise could have. The meeting stretched on, voices rising and settling, plans forming cautiously. Jonah proposed organizing materials, sharing designs. Brooks offered labor. Others offered nothing but silence. And that, Elias understood, was not refusal, just fear working itself out. At last, as lanterns burned low, Jonah called the meeting to a close. People filtered out slowly, speaking in quieter tones. Some nodded at Elias as they passed. A few did not. Both reactions felt honest. Outside, the cold bit deep again. Bracken rose when Elias stepped out, tail thumping once before settling. The sky above Cheyenne was clear and hard, stars sharp as broken glass. Harold Keene emerged last, coat collar turned up. He paused beside Elias. "You changed the game," he said, "whether you meant to or not." Elias met his gaze. "I didn't mean to." Keene smiled thinly. "That's how it usually happens." He walked off into the dark. Elias stood for a moment longer, listening to the town breathe around him. He felt no triumph, no relief. Only the steady weight of what came next. The barn would not be enough forever. The town would try. Some would fail. Some would succeed. And all of it would trace back to a winter when one man refused to stop at the first answer. Elias turned toward home, Bracken at his side, knowing that the hardest part was no longer the cold. It was being seen. Spring did not arrive with ceremony. It crept in the way truth often does, quietly, almost apologetically, testing the land before committing itself. The snow did not vanish overnight. It thinned first, pulling back from fence posts, shrinking into gray piles along the north sides of buildings. The air softened by degrees so small they were easy to miss unless a man had spent weeks watching his breath hang heavy before his face. Elias Crowder noticed the change one morning when the barn smelled different. The sharp bite of cold was still there, but beneath it lay something damp and living. Earth, waking. He stood in the open doorway, coat unbuttoned for the first time in weeks, and let the light fall across the interior. The warming huts were still lined along the wall, their wood darkened from use, their edges worn smooth by hands and hooves. Inside them, lambs stirred, no longer curled tight for survival, but stretching, testing their legs with awkward confidence. There were 11 of them now. Not all had been born under his roof. Some had arrived later, brought carefully by men who had once laughed and now carried their lambs as if they were glass. Not all had lived. Elias did not count the dead anymore. He counted what remained. Martha moved among the pens, her step lighter than it had been in months. She carried a small bucket of grain, scattering it where ewes could reach without jostling. Her face still bore the marks of winter, skin pale, lines etched deeper by worry. But there was color returning to her cheeks. She hummed softly, not a tune Elias recognized, but something steady and unbroken. Outside, voices drifted across the yard. The first wagons arrived just after sunrise. Lumber stacked high, oilcloth rolled tight, tools tied down with rope. Men climbed down slowly, stretching backs stiff from cold and travel. Leonard Brooks was among them, sleeves already rolled, beard trimmed neat. He had brought 2 apprentices this time, boys. Barely out of school, faces earnest, hands raw from inexperience. Brooks nodded at Elias. "Ground's soft enough to work," he said. "Figured we'd start here." Elias nodded once. "Take the measurements from the first hut, not the last." Brooks smiled faintly. "I remember." By midday, the yard had become something between a worksite and a gathering. No speeches, no announcements, just people moving with purpose. Jonah Bell arrived on horseback, dismounting stiffly. He looked older than he had a month ago, the storm having carved something permanent into his posture. He said little, but when he did, men listened. Nathan Cole worked alongside the younger hands, showing them how to set stones properly, how to space vents so heat stayed where it was needed. He spoke sparingly, but when he corrected someone, it was without judgment. His authority came from experience, not insistence. Harold Keene arrived later, as expected, but he stayed near the edge this time, watching rather than directing. He spoke briefly with Jonah, then left without making offers. The market could wait. This was not a day for it. A new face appeared just before afternoon, a man Elias did not know, riding a chestnut horse with a high, nervous head. The rider was thin, sharp-featured, with a dark mustache waxed into neat points and eyes that missed very little. He wore a long coat better suited to town than mud. He introduced himself as Paul Harrington, an extension agent from Laramie, newly assigned to the region. 35 years old, educated, cautious. His hands were clean, but his boots bore fresh scuffs where he had clearly tried to help before remembering how unfamiliar he was with labor. "I heard about your shelters," Harrington said, removing his hat. "The college would be interested." Elias looked at him steadily. "They don't belong to me anymore." Harrington blinked. I don't follow. They belong to anyone who builds them, Elias said. I didn't invent heat. I just stopped pretending it didn't matter. Harrington smiled slowly. That may be the most useful thing anyone said to me this year. He spent the afternoon sketching, measuring, asking questions. Elias answered some and deferred others to Brooks or Cole. By the time Harrington left, his notebook was thick with graphite and his boots thoroughly ruined. As the sun dipped lower, the work slowed. New huts stood half-finished in the yard, their shapes familiar now. The lambs bleated louder, more demanding, their voices no longer thin with need but sharp with appetite. Elias opened the first hut and guided the lambs out one by one. They stumbled into the open, blinking, hooves unsure on thaw-softened ground. One fell immediately and scrambled up again, indignant. Another trotted a short distance before stopping abruptly, startled by its own courage. Bracken moved among them calmly, guiding without pressure, his bent ear twitching. He had aged during the winter too, his muzzle showing more gray now, but his eyes were bright, his purpose intact. Martha watched from the fence line. When the last lamb stood on its own, she let out a breath she had been holding since the first snowfall. That evening, as the workers drifted away and the yard settled into quiet again, Elias sat on an overturned crate near the barn door. His hands were empty for the first time in days. The ache in his body felt different now, not sharp, not urgent, just there. Jonah Bell joined him, lowering himself carefully onto the crate beside him. They sat without speaking for a long moment. You didn't have to do this, Jonah said eventually. You know that. Elias nodded. I know. Jonah rubbed his hands together, staring out at the yard. I've been thinking about last year, he said. About the ones we lost. I told myself it was weather. That's what I always told myself. And now? Elias asked. Jonah's mouth tightened. Now I know it was choice. The admission hung between them, heavy but clean. I won't make it again, Jonah said. Elias believed him. As twilight settled, Martha came out with 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed one to Elias, one to Jonah, then sat on the step nearby. They drank in silence, watching the lambs move awkwardly toward their mothers, the ewes answering with low, steady sounds. Spring would still take time. The nights would remain cold. Loss would not vanish simply because people had learned something new. Elias knew that better than most. But when he looked at the barn now, he no longer saw a desperate shelter built against winter. He saw a place where knowledge had changed hands without being claimed, where stubbornness had softened into resolve, where survival had been shared instead of guarded. Paul Harrington returned a week later with papers and plans. Elias signed none of them. Leonard Brooks began building huts across the county. Nathan Cole found steady work teaching men how to tend fire without fear. Martha took over the ledger, her handwriting firm and certain. And Elias returned to the quiet work of watching animals breathe. One evening, as the sun finally dipped warm and gold behind the hills, Elias stood alone in the pasture. Bracken sat beside him. The lambs moved freely now, their legs strong, their bodies sure. Winter had asked its questions. At last, spring had answered. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes, they come quietly, through tired hands that refuse to give up, through small acts of care when no one is watching. Maybe that barn was not just wood and straw. Maybe it was a reminder that God often works through ordinary people, people who choose compassion when the world says, that's just the way it is. In our own lives, we face winters too, moments when the cold feels endless, when help feels far away, when we wonder if trying again is worth the pain. But this story reminds us, doing the right thing, even when it seems small, can become a blessing far greater than we ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be facing their own winter tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe that kindness still matters, and that no child or animal should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to the Tsatinite channel so we can keep sharing stories of hope together. May God watch over you, protect your loved ones, and bring warmth into every cold place you are carrying. Until next time, keep faith and keep choosing compassion.